welcome to hearing a little bit about the future of real estate agent compensation. This is Marketing Monday. I'm Allie Jackson with Centennial Escrow. We started out these Marketing Mondays, oh my goodness, I started these out when the pandemic started, and they've always been done over Zoom. And so this is our first time of actually doing one of these live and in person, face to face, belly to belly, and I think it's great. What do you all think? It's a good way to learn and connect and do a little bit of networking as well. I want to make sure also that everyone put their business card in the drawing jar because some of our sponsors brought some really, really nice raffle prizes along. So I want to first just acknowledge our sponsors and helpers who all came together and ask you to come up and just take a minute to tell us a little bit about your business and who you are. So let's start with Tessa since you're closest to the steps here.
Good morning, Tessa Sims, Agent Real Estate Schools. I'm paying attention for any implicit bias for housing violations here today. So what should no, I'm just kidding, you guys. I'm really serious. Like 10 o'clock now, come on. Just kidding. Just a little tip. Landlord will be going away and replaced with, guess what? Property provider. There's your tip for the morning.
Okay, well that was a hard act to follow. Thank you so much, Ms. Allie, for letting us come and support you this morning. My name is Marie Belknap with California Title. I'm one of the helpers, and I will have my partner speak too.
And I am Ricky Bright from Cal Title, and thank you guys for coming. We actually have, one thing that really sets us apart is we have 6 underwriters for title. So we can be super competitive and we can always find a fit for your deal. So give us a try with Cal Title, and thank you guys again for coming.
Good morning, my name's Andrew at Mortgage One, and as a lender I suppose I'm supposed to stand up here and talk about how rates are going up or going down, but I'm not going to do that because we should all be building businesses that are resilient in any market. So that's my spiel. I do have a raffle over here at the end, but it's nothing compared to Gary's raffle because he's giving away a lifetime supply of ice cream from Handles. So be sure you...
Thank you, Andrew. Pass it on to Brandon. You meant Brandon. You meant Brandon.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Gary Smith, Super Home Warranty. Just thank you for you guys all coming out today. I know it's a crazy day for weather-wise, but either way, I've been with Super for about 7 months, and it's a whole new approach to home warranty. It's an app-based product. We've been in business for 8 years now, and gosh, lots of good stuff. I won't go into it, but either way, the app is customized. So if you initiate the order, that app has your information on it. Your clients see that all the time when they use a home warranty. So it's good stuff, and that's all I have for you. All right.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, Brandon with the Goldberg team, your home loan surgeons. We do home loans, obviously. I appreciate you guys coming out. I'd really like to get to know you as a person and see if we're a good fit. We can help you out with something. But pass it over to my man Ted.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, thanks for coming out. You know, I drove from San Diego, but I left at like 7 in the morning because it wasn't raining. So I got here early. Go the other way now. But I do hard money loans, and if you need help with fix and flips or stuff that's outside the box that banks won't do, give me a call. And thanks again.
Good morning all, Don, Inside Photos. Inside Photos, all we do is real estate photography. We do photos, video, aerials, Matterports, you name it. And we do it 7 days a week. So you can always count on us. And today, I'm your paparazzi. So have fun with those. And I'm doing 2 drawings for floor plans. So if you've seen those, you'll get a chance to test those out. All right, thanks.
As I mentioned, I'm with Centennial Escrow. We have a couple of phenomenal escrow officers. We're located not too far away from the village here in Carlsbad. We can take care of all of your escrow needs from mobile home to your multi-million-dollar estates and everything in between, including multiplex. And I come along with the package, and I love working on marketing and events and things to help you grow your business because together we win. wanted to just ask our speakers to come up here, Saul and Karen, if you could just step on up. So Karen Van Ness and Saul Klein are our guest speakers today, and really appreciate the depth and breadth that you're going to be going into. Saul's going to be talking a little bit about the N.A.R lawsuits, and Karen will be talking about the buyer-broker agreement in a really great detail, so that you don't just know about it, you know how to use it, because that's a cornerstone on making sure you're properly compensated for representing buyers. And just as a little thank you from the sponsor team here, we just wanted to give you each a little something. So, thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming. And one more thing I did want to mention is, any of you like to have listings or share your buyer needs and network with one another? Bueller? Yeah? Okay. Because twice a month, a lot of these affiliates here are in a group called Hot Properties, and we do a pitch right in the village up at La Papagayo the first and third Thursday. So if you haven't been to that, you want to know more about it, give me a jingle. On the front of the handout, there's a list of all the affiliates there with all of our contact information. So I'm on there as well, so feel free to reach out. And there's also a little flyer that has my number on it about Centennial Escrow. So without further ado, I think we're about to get rocking and rolling, right? So Saul's gonna kick us off. There's a little info. If you registered, hopefully you had a moment to read a little bit about our speakers. But Saul is known as the father of technology with real estate. And he is president of SDMLS. I don't want to miss all this stuff. He's called the first Internet Evangelist. He was selected by N.A.R as one of the 25 most influential people in real estate, and also selected from Inman News as one of the 100 most influential real estate people, like 10 times, right?
They didn't have any people to choose.
So I just wanted to mention that, and he also was the creator of the first online real estate communities called RealTalk. He first developed that for N.A.R in 1995, and he's still active with the community. He's original member of the first Realtor.com team, and one of the few visionaries who paved the way for real estate's transition into technology. Saul was recently out in Paris at an international conference, because a lot of people in real estate in other countries want to know a little bit more about the MLS system and how to set it up, and so he provides a lot of education in that. So I'm sorry if I left anything out, but he's a great guy. So everybody, please welcome Saul Klein.
Being on a platform is interesting. I taught real estate classes at a place called Anthony Schools. Anybody remember Anthony Schools? I did that for like 20 years. And they always had a platform in the room, and you taught from a platform. I haven't been on a platform, be a little careful I don't fall off. So we're going to talk today about, and actually I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk story with you. I'm going to tell you what, why, and then Karen's going to tell you how. So Karen's got the important stuff. What I'm going to tell you is what you can utilize when you're just talking to people about this. You need to get a feel for this. So we'll start out with this concept of a paradigm. How many of you heard of a paradigm? Right here, paradigm. Paradigm is a model. That's all it is. It's a model. And there's paradigms in everything. Like American football, there's a paradigm for American football. There's a paradigm for football that they play in the rest of the world as well. It's just a set of rules. People follow a set. We have a paradigm about the way we sell real estate. And you've heard this term before, paradigm shift. And so we're going through right now in real estate, a lot of people don't realize this, we're going through a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is a fundamental change. Not just change. Change, that's not good enough. This is fundamental change. I started selling real estate in San Diego in 1975, and it's changed a lot over the years. And I got involved in technology, and I was on the first Realtor.com team, and we put listings on the internet. And what's happening right now is bigger than anything that's happened in the past. And I talked to somebody about this morning about the fact that things always change in this industry, and things do always change. But this is major. And so what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the lawsuits. And they are many, more than I can talk about, as a matter of fact. So I created a handout last night. Now, to get it all on one page, I made a real small font, right, that I can't even read. And so the information I'm going to talk to you about today is information. People are hearing about these lawsuits. People know about it. People heard about the $5 billion decision in Missouri, the Sitzer-Burnett case. People have heard of N.A.R. People have heard of MLS PIN. You might have heard the other day that the California Association of Realtors has been named. CRMLS has been named. 25 MLSs have been named. You might have heard of the settlements. There are about $208 million in settlements already. This is major. Maybe you've even heard of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission being involved. This is going to bring about a paradigm shift in real estate. So knowledge is power, and knowledge is a differentiator, and I guarantee you that if you haven't been approached yet by buyers and sellers about this issue, you will be. I participated on a phone call with, I went to the Naval Academy, and I have my classmates in my company who graduated in 1972. My classmates in my company, we have a Zoom call every other week. And for the last 50-some years, no one's ever asked me about real estate in this group of intimate friends and classmates that I have. But 2 weeks ago, they asked me about real estate for the first time. And they asked about the litigation that's going on, because they're reading about it everywhere. So if you haven't been asked, you will be, and you want to have answers because your competitors won't. And most people don't know about this. And I also created a handout that goes into some depth, but I did it in November, and it's obsolete because there's probably about 50 more cases since. They call them copycat cases. But there's links, and this will, when you want to get some background, it's a good handout to give you some background. So, the subject of the litigation that you're reading about or you're hearing about is something that referred to as the broker compensation clause. The broker compensation clause, and the complaint, and I'll tell you, as you read about this, as you hear about this, you're going to disagree with the plaintiffs. And you're going to say, that's crazy, that's not how it works, and it doesn't matter what you think, and it doesn't matter what I think. And so, I'm not going to argue with anybody about this. This is where we are right now. And so, the case revolves around the broker compensation clause. Now, you're familiar with MLS, and actually my position at the MLS is I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the San Diego MLS. That happened on December 18th. So now I'm leading our MLS here in San Diego. And as many institutions, brokerage firms in Texas, even teams have been named, which makes you kind of wonder when individuals can be named. We're going to see probably litigating across the country. No MLS will probably escape from this. And so it's something you really want to follow, because what's challenged is the way you get compensated. And so the way that you get compensated is, you think about this, in real estate you don't need 2 contracts with consumers to be compensated. You only need 1 contract. Typically it's the listing agreement, it's with the seller, and then if you belong to a multiple listing service, the multiple listing service is an offer of compensation. And so if it's your first day in real estate, you happen to get a buyer, you take them out and show them property, it doesn't matter that you have no experience at all, you don't have to have a contract with that buyer. If you're a member of the multiple listing service, you're going to get compensated if that transaction closes. And so 1 contract and membership in the multiple listing service is what allows compensation. And that's the way it's been since 1996. And again, I'm going to give you the story, the history. And I think it's important for you to know this, because so many people don't know this. Prior to 1996, well, I'm going to go back a step. All MLSs, not all, most MLSs, multiple listing services in this country, follow MLS best practices promulgated by the National Association of Realtors. So the National Association of Realtors doesn't have an MLS. But it has rules, and if your local MLS follow the rules and they're owned by a realtor organization, then the MLS can be covered by the errors and omission insurance of the National Association of Realtors. And of course, everybody wants to be covered by that errors and omission insurance, so we all follow the rules. And so N.A.R. has these model rules. And prior to, I'm going to take you back, about 1983, the Federal Trade Commission investigated the residential real estate industry and said, this is not right, buyers aren't represented. And even worse, buyers don't know they're not represented. Now, how many of you don't have to raise your hand, just think about this. Remember the fact that when you sold real estate in the 1980s and early 90s, you represented the seller. It didn't matter if you brought in the offer and you worked with the buyer, you represented the seller. We were kind of talking pre-licensing. Everybody represented the seller in a real estate transaction. And the reason everybody represented the seller is the MLS rule was that the MLS is a unilateral offer of subagency. That's what it was. Everybody remember that? Subagency? It was a unilateral offer of subagency. And that meant if you were a member of the MLS and you brought in an offer, you didn't even know who the seller was, but you brought in the offer, you were representing the seller. Actually, the broker that represented the seller, you were a subagent. And so everybody represented the seller. And we didn't tell the buyer that. Right? There was no requirement that we say to the buyer, anything you tell me, I'm going to tell the seller. Because we all represent this. We owe fairness and good faith to the buyer, but we owed a fiduciary duty to the seller, and everybody did, and that was the way it was structured. And then in the early 80s in California, and we were the first state to do this, we started to see push for legislation to disclose to buyers and to sellers who was representing them in real estate transactions. And so in 1986 in California, we passed the first agency disclosure law, and they gave us 15 months to put it into practice. And so the MLS again was an offer of subagency, and we all of a sudden we had to tell buyers and sellers who we represented. And you recall, I know you do this every day, that you can represent you can represent principals in real estate transactions 3 ways in California. You can represent the buyer exclusively, you can represent the seller exclusively, you can represent the buyer and the seller as a dual agent. There's also legislation to outlaw dual agency at the time. And CAR got involved, and they came up with this compromise. They said, let's just let consumers make the choice. If you disclose to them the representation that's available, let the consumer decide. And so we got these agency disclosure laws. In 1988, we had to start presenting the disclosure statement. It wasn't a contract, it was a disclosure statement. Some of you might recall that. But there wasn't a lot of training about it, so here you are, you got a buyer, now you have to make a disclosure. You look at the form, it says there are 3 ways to represent principals in real estate transactions. You can represent the buyer, you can represent the seller, you can represent both as a dual agency. You're not the listing agent, so you know you don't check that box. You're not a dual, you're not representing both, so you don't check that box, so which box do you check? You check the box that says you represent the buyer exclusively. You're now guilty of a divided agency, because you couldn't represent the buyer exclusively because you were a member of the MLS, and the MLS was a unilateral offer of subagency and everybody represented the seller, but you just lied to the buyer. And that's a divided agency, and they can disgorge commissions, and you don't want to be involved in divided agencies. And so the California Association of Realtors realized that all realtors were at risk. And so they went about trying to force N.A.R. to change the MLS. And so in California, we came up with this idea that maybe the MLS rules should say that the MLS is, instead of being an offer of subagency, it's an offer of compensation. And so in California in about 1992, we changed our rules, our MLS rules, because the National Association wouldn't do it. So California said, well, we're going to do it anyway, because we've got too many agents at risk. Because they're checking the wrong box on the form because they don't know any better. And so in California, they called them the California Association of Realtors Model Rules. We changed to an offer of compensation, and in 1996, N.A.R. changed its rules. And so the rules became, the MLS became, if you read the bylaws of our MLS in San Diego, of most MLSs, right there in the bylaws it says that the MLS is an offer of compensation. And it's been that way since 1996. And you disclose, I know you do, that all commissions are negotiable. But then what happened about 3 years ago is in Missouri and first in Illinois, sellers actually said, you know, we didn't know that we didn't have to pay the buyer's agent. We're paying the buyer's agent. We didn't know and so this is a conspiracy to charge more commissions than should be charged. And that's the crux of these cases. And of course, the biggest case initially was Merrill, M-O-E-H-L-R, and that's in Illinois. The next case was Sitzer Burnett, and that was in Missouri. And then there was one on the East Coast, MLS PIN, that's Multiple Listing Service, Property Information Networks in Boston, New England area. And those were the three big cases, and the one that went to trial first was Sitzer Burnett. Now, if you look at this outline, I actually stated for you history of MLS, unilateral offer of subagency, and what took place in '96, and I named some of the cases. And then what happened is the first one to go to trial was in Missouri, Sitzer Burnett, and Anywhere, you're familiar with the corporation Anywhere, the big franchises, you know, Century 21, Coldwell Banker, ERA, and I'll always miss a few of these, right? Better Homes. So this big company owns these franchises. They settled. Now, I've got to tell you something. When a big corporation got good attorneys, right? And they settled for $83.5 million. And then RE/MAX settled for $55 million before there was a judgment. And then you have to know this about antitrust cases. There's two ways that they can be decided. One is per se, and the other is rule of reason. And so if it's going to go rule of reason, then you can make all your good cases about how good MLS is and all the good things it accomplishes. But if it's per se, no, judge didn't want to hear that, jury didn't want to hear that. It's a conspiracy from their perspective, and the only thing to decide are the damages. And so the jury took about 2 hours to make their decision, and they awarded about $1.56 billion in damages. And because it's an antitrust case, they triple them. And so it's about $5 billion in the first case. And the next day, the attorney that handled that case filed another case called Gibson, and they're estimating that that's in the $100 billion damage range. And we still haven't heard in Illinois, that's the next one, and what's going to happen then with all the other cases. And now these attorneys, they see the settlements, and they're thinking, you know what, there must be something here. And so there are cases filed, I think there were like 25 in Texas a month or so ago. I mentioned we just had CAR was named, and a bunch of MLSs and associations were named in California. This is going to continue. They're going to continue because it's a conspiracy in the eyes of these attorneys. And if it's a conspiracy, we're no different in San Diego than the other MLSs. We all follow the same rules. So it's not like our rules are different and we haven't been named yet, and so that must mean we're innocent. No, we haven't been named yet because we all can speculate why, because they just haven't identified. It's kind of hard to identify all the MLSs in the country, right? And where are they? And so eventually you'll probably see if the DOJ and the FTC doesn't get involved, that MLSs are going to be named everywhere. So the other day you might have read that Keller Williams settled. $70 million. You think they settled because they think they can win? Right? $70 million is a lot of money. And so now you got $208 million in settlements, $5 billion case, hundreds of billions of dollars. The FTC, that's the Federal Trade Commission, which is like the police force, and the DOJ, the Department of Justice, looking at this, and what they're after is changing the MLS rules. And what they want to get rid of is the offer of compensation. And so, well, you know, we haven't always been an offer of compensation. We were once an offer of subagency. and for almost 30 years, we're an offer of compensation. And that's what's being attacked right now, is the offer of compensation. So what happens if the offer of compensation belonging to an MLS goes away? The MLS has still got value, it's still got inventory, it's still the best inventory. Everybody still wants to have access to that MLS inventory. But the thing that might not be there, and I'd say won't be there in the future, is the offer of compensation. So no longer will you, as a member of the MLS, be guaranteed that you're going to be compensated if you take a buyer out and show them property. And so that's why understanding buyer-broker agreements are so important to you today, because that's the direction of the industry. What do you do in this environment? Right? So what can you do in your regular real estate? I think, number one, you got to just keep doing what you're doing. You got to keep listing and selling real estate. But while you're doing that, disclose and make sure you disclose in no uncertain terms that all commissions are negotiable. And make sure you disclose that the seller does not have to pay the agent that represents the buyer. Now, there was a myth that you always had to put something in the MLS, even if it was $1. Anybody recall that myth? No, I didn't put $1. It never was $1. The technology made it so you had to put a number in. And that's why the idea that you had to put $1 in there came up. But the fact is, the National Association of Realtors has confirmed this, that you can offer zero compensation if you're the seller. There's no requirement in the MLS rules that you offer anything. And so when you're taking a listing, it's imperative that you make it known to sellers that they don't have to offer anything to the agent that represents the buyer. But I would add this: I think it's important for a buyer to be represented. I think it's important for a seller to know how important it is for a buyer to be represented. And so while it's not required that a seller compensate the buyer's agent, it's typically in their best interest to do so. Your listing presentation should maybe start to focus on the benefits that an agent of the buyer brings and why it's okay for the seller to pay that, even though they're not required to do so, and then you document those conversations. And then learn how to use a buyer-broker contract. And the California Association of Realtors has done a great job over the years in moving this concept forward. In 1991, I wrote a course. I mentioned I was teaching real estate classes in the Anthony schools. And when they passed the agency disclosure law, I thought this is a great time to start to represent buyers. And I actually put together a course. I called it How to List Buyers. I think it was 4 cassettes. You can listen to these 4 cassette tapes on how, and the agency, when you're making your agency disclosure, it's an opportune time to start to explain to the seller why it's important that the buyer be represented. And if you work with a buyer, it's an ideal time to say to the buyer, this is why I asked you to sign a contract with me and I'm your fiduciary and you know that story. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We're talking about major litigation that's going to change the offer of compensation in the MLS. And when that happens, how do you guarantee that you're going to be paid? You can take a buyer out, and if there's no offer of compensation, and you write the offer and there's no offer of compensation, and you have no contract with the buyer, then you're just out of luck. And the way to protect yourself in this case is to make sure you understand buyer contracts, you use them. And I know it's hard because not everybody uses them, right? That was always the argument. I'm not going to use a buyer contract, but nobody else uses them. And if I ask the buyer to sign a contract, they're just going to walk across the street to another real estate agent that doesn't make them sign it. And that's one of the reasons we haven't seen it integrated, buyer-broker contracts over the years integrated into the practice of real estate, because of the structure, which was an offer of compensation where all that was required was the listing agreement with the seller, membership in the MLS, and agents that represented buyers could then be compensated. So you want to look for new methods of compensation as well. We're going to see new ideas on how you can be compensated. And they're really kind of mostly old ideas, right? That maybe some people will be compensated by the hour. Maybe they'll offer a menu of services. I was talking to some people the other day that are looking at asking for compensation based upon how much money the buyer saves using that agent. So there are a lot of different ways to look at this. They are changing dramatically, will continue to change. I wouldn't be surprised to see if there's not complete settlement. Now, who's left in the major entities in the lawsuits? National Association of Realtors, and N.A.R. didn't have enough money for this. I mean, if they're appealing, and they put up a good case, but it's hard to fight a per se approach to antitrust. And so N.A.R. is still involved, and Home Services of America, the Berkshire Hathaway, is still involved, have not settled yet. And so we're kind of waiting to see what these other big players do. And as I mentioned, in Texas, brokerage firms have been named, and teams have been named. And if they're down to the team level, what's the next possible step? So I can see it. Like if you listed and sold real, because these cases go back like 4 years. The damages are calculated on people who sold real estate in the last 4 years. And so if you've listed and sold real estate in the last 4 years, I'm not saying you're a target, but you can look at this and you should pay attention to these cases in this litigation. And also when these companies settle, that might change the liability of the agents that work for these companies. So you should be looking at that as well. So, any questions? Yes, sir?
You and I are probably licensed longer than most of these kids have been alive. And I followed your story right up until the last part about going over the details with the seller on how important it is to have the buyer represented, which I thought was already established in law. Okay, are you then discussing compensation for the buyer or not? And how does that change anything?
So two things.
From the way we were doing this.
So the first thing is there's nothing in the law that says a buyer needs to be represented.
Oh, I thought that.
No, it's no, there's nothing in the law that says a buyer has to be represented.
Okay.
Okay? So you make your disclosure, you can represent them. And typically what happens is if a buyer walks into an open house and works directly with the listing agent will probably say they're a dual agent because they might be held liable as an ostensible or an apparent agent by doing something that an agent would do, right? So to protect ourselves, we've been advised to say, hey, we're acting as an agent. But the law doesn't say that you have to, but you're opening yourself up to possibly, right? So what was the other point?
Well, when you're discussing with the seller the ethical and legal elements of representing the buyer as well, do you discuss compensation?
You do discuss compensation.
Let's say you're talking 3%, just out of historic.
You were supposed to loudly protest and walk out, right? Go ahead.
And the seller says, okay. How did that change anything from what we've been doing forever and ever through the MLS?
It doesn't matter that it doesn't change anything. What's being said is that was wrong. There was a conspiracy to force commissions on sellers for buyers' agents that didn't have to be there, and that because there is this conspiracy. So it doesn't matter that we believe what we were doing was the right thing. It doesn't matter that what happens when you offer compensation to someone who has a buyer, that you increase the chances of selling the property. Right? Those are all good things, that it creates them. It doesn't matter. What is being said is that there's a conspiracy to force commissions, and that per se is a problem, and you and I can't change that.
Okay,
right?
And how do you approach the seller with the buyer's commission? I mean, what would not be conspiratorial?
Well, I think if you're talking, you could list better than me the benefits of this buyer being represented, right? Number one, they're probably maybe pre-qualified. Number two, that agent is then liable to that buyer, and that might relieve some of the liability on the seller's side. Number three, it opens up and it encourages people all over town to bring buyers to, right? So we could probably sit down and brainstorm through a list of benefits, and that's important, but here's what you don't want to say. You don't want to say, the reason I think you should do this is because if you don't, nobody will show your property.
Oh, the truth would be damned.
Because in these cases, that's said to be steering. You remember I started by saying, it doesn't matter what you think, it doesn't matter what I think, what matters is the decision that's come down. And we're going to have to live with that, and we're going to have to figure out ways around it. So if I were listing property today, I would make a list of all of the benefits of having that buyer represented, and I would present that when I'm talking to the seller. I think it's critical. I think now it becomes imperative that the agent that represents the seller convince the seller how important it is that the buyer have representation on their side.
And compensation?
And compensation. How else are you going to motivate her?
Well, that's a critical point I was trying to make, was how do you bridge this conspiratorial gap with suggesting, or do you suggest compensation?
I think you have to remember all commissions are negotiable. You've got to have a conversation about commission.
Two questions. Can you say in that conversation with the seller, in my experience, I have found it's best to blah, 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 compensate my buyers?
I'd be very careful. I talked to your corporate counsel about that. As a matter of fact, I would run by your listing presentation, by your broker first, and then whoever represents the company as to what exactly you're going to say in that listing presentation. Because there's no doubt that there are benefits to the seller when the buyer is represented. And you want to be honest. You have a fiduciary duty to be honest, right, and to be able to disclose it. Just have to be careful now, because this concept of steering, they call it. Now, I always relate steering to fair housing. But now they're talking steering, because, and actually in Missouri, they went into the MLS and they looked to see how many properties was the commission offered lower than what was normally offered, and how many agents showed the property. And that was part of the evidence in the case. They went into the MLS and got that information. Yeah.
So, on the California listing agreement, right there, it says exactly what the seller's paying. So for all this steering and all this crap, I mean, in California, they've known, and if they haven't read the contract, if the listing agent didn't go through it, but they still read it, they should have, they signed it. I don't understand why they can get away with it.
So Karen's going to talk about the California contract.
Yeah.
And in California, that's kind of like what CAR is telling us, is we're well protected in California, right? But we'll see, right? We've got cases right now that have been filed against MLSs and associations of realtors and the California Association of Realtors. So we'll see how well those clauses in the contracts protect us. But I tell you this, best practices would indicate that you want to make sure you understand those contracts, and if you're not using them, you start to learn how to use them and introduce them into your business.
But the seller, I mean, if the seller doesn't read it, the seller doesn't
Well, you know what, I think oftentimes we've got situations in the past where people sign something and then are not held responsible for what they sign. It wouldn't be a first time, right? Yes.
I have a couple of questions. One is, if you're Thank you. My first question is, if I agree with you, I think it's coming off the MLS, any kind of buyer broker compensation. But what do you envision will be used to kind of give that information to buyers agents? I mean, it has to be known somehow. Is it 0? Is it 2%? Is it 1%? Like, how do you envision realtors, buyer agents, knowing what is or isn't offered?
So that will change over time. Right now, in San Diego, we have the capability to put in 0. You might see it move the remarks section. This is something that we're dealing with all the time. You might see, we're having conversations in San Diego about changing our bylaws and taking the offer of compensation piece out of the bylaws, right? Because as long as they're in there, we're part of this conspiracy, right?
Yeah. Okay, and the second question is, do you envision, and this might be a question for some of the lenders in the room, do you envision a time where buyers compensation might be tied somehow to the loan but unattached to the home?
Well, so it's interesting.
Because you need the house to appraise, right?
So that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And right now, though, with appraisals, commission's baked into the appraisals. It's there, right?
Yeah.
Like, the appraiser doesn't say, well, this one sold for owner, so here we just subtract the commission. So it's all baked in anyway. The issue is lenders and the secondary money market, Fannie and Freddie, and how will they approach this? And here's my thought about that. If this becomes the way it's done, the lenders still want to make loans. And the secondary money market still wants to buy loans, package mortgage-backed securities, sell them to pension funds. So there's still this desire and need. And so if it changes on the retail end, it'll change, and we'll get to a point. People bring up VA loans, right? Because veterans aren't allowed to. It'll all kind of fall into place. It all starts here. And then the appraisal thing is kind of interesting to watch, but again, it's all baked into it anyway. And I've always said for years, what creates the commission is not, really the seller doesn't pay the commission, and really the buyer doesn't pay the commission, the transaction does. And without the transaction, you don't have a commission generated. And so people are going to start looking at the transaction as the event, and then everything will work its way from that. And it's going to be a little bumpy initially. As we transition. Remember, I started by saying this is a paradigm shift. This is not just a change, this is a fundamental change to the way in which we do business. Think about anybody sell commercial real estate? Commercial real estate's a lot different, isn't it? Right? And it doesn't work the same way. So start thinking about the way real estate is listed and sold in the commercial world. And it might kind of move down that path. Yes?
So you mentioned that teams are being named in these lawsuits and it could trickle down to agents, but the listing agreement is between the broker and the seller, so how would that trickle down to individual agents?
When they start looking for pockets for these huge awards, they will start to move down the line. And then I didn't mention, there's also a couple of suits right now on the buy side. Right, so now this is starting to pop up. So there is some liability. That's why I think it's important that you start tracking this, following this. And so if you're interested, write this down. This is where I write, where I post, and my business partner, John Riley, who's doesn't practice anymore, he's a recovering attorney. TheDataAdvocate.com, TheDataAdvocate.com. And as we find information, as we read things, as we get opinions from people, we'll publish them on TheDataAdvocate.com. Any other questions before I give this to Karen?